Hello and welcome to another module. This time we're discussing fermentation for FSHN 101. We would be remiss when we talk about fermentation if we didn't start with a little history of yogurt. Yogurt first appeared during the Neolithic period around 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. And the word yogurt is believed to have come from the Turkish word yogurmak, which means to thicken or coagulate. Today, most yogurt is fermented milk and is known for its health benefits, which include more protein per 100 grams compared to a glass of milk itself, better digestive health for those who consume it, and an increase in heart health, in addition to many other benefits. So you may have been interested in yogurt, but let's talk about the history of beer, which may be even more interesting to you. For example, fermented beverages first developed over 12,000 years ago, so before yogurt was even thought of. The first beer came from the Middle East around 5,000 years ago, and the word beer came from the Latin-rooted word of bibere. Consumption of beer took off during the Babylonian Empire, where the Code of Hammurabi gave 1 beer a day to its citizens. So, free beer every day. With regard to beer, modern tasting beer arrived during the Middle Ages with artisans starting to brew beer with hops, which is the main ingredient in most beers today. And now there are different variations all over the world with their own unique flavor profiles. For example, I love a good IPA or an India Pale Ale. They're oftentimes very hoppy, bitter, with a little lower effervescence. Sometimes they can have a citrusy flavor to them, but they might also have what we call a higher octane or a higher alcohol content. So let's talk about another fermented food, sauerkraut. The Chinese first fermented cabbage rice wine over 2,000 years ago. And in the 16th century, Europeans adopted this habit of fermenting cabbage in its own juices, which created what we now think of as sauerkraut. In summer, slaves built the Great Wall and they lived on cabbage and rice, and in the winter, the cabbage was preserved with that rice wine, which soured the cabbage and then became known as sauerkraut. The word sauerkraut came from German and means sour cabbage. So not very creative, but definitely accurate. Sauerkraut is a well-known superfood, meaning that it has a lot of health benefits. It's got a lot of folate, vitamin B6, as well as vitamin K. So you may look at this slide and say, what? Genghis Khan and his link to these foods? Well, like we mentioned, we enjoy discussing different individuals who have a pronounced impact on our food itself. And Genghis Khan was the founder of the largest contiguous empire ever, so there are some interesting connections to the foods that we've discussed. For example, the spread of fermented cabbage to Germany can be attributed to the nomadic Tatar group of the people who were heavily involved with Genghis. Yogurt spread was also aided by Khan, as soldiers were reported to carry it with them. So, something kind of interesting when we look at the history a little further. When we discuss the functional groups of foods that are fermented, chemistry is there and it's fully throughout this conversation. Chemistry defines fermentation differently than other educational fields. So for example, chemically, fermentation refers to the metabolic process where molecules are converted into acids, gases, or alcohol when oxygen is not present. The main sugared fermentation is glucose a lot of times, and it yields less energy when oxygen is absent. But you may say, well, do we have benefits to no oxygen in fermentation? Sometimes there are some, such as improved nutritional value, increased synthesis of vitamins, distinct acquired flavor profile. So sometimes we have fermentation that we can control as food scientists to make the perfect product as to what we're going for. When we discuss functional groups in fermentation a little further, yeast is used in beer to help ferment glucose, and it produces alcohol during that process. These alcohols are made during fermentation, and they're comprised of the functional group hydroxyl. The functional groups are the atomic structures of molecules that are responsible for their characteristic chemical reactions, taste, smell, structure, and more. So yes, when you think of something like a beer, or again, for something that's fermented with yeast, oftentimes you do think about that alcohol itself. Many molecules contain functional groups that are overexpressed during fermentation, like aldehydes found from many plants. They're produced during fermentation, as well as highly fermented foods contain things that are high in aldehyde, and we can have it so high that it can potentially cause some toxicity issues. So we want to make sure that we are fermenting properly and consuming a product that has been approved through, again, the food scientist along that path. When we discuss moisture content and fermentation, microorganisms, including bacteria, they love water to become as active as possible. The lactic strain in sauerkraut requires a water activity of 0.95 or higher to grow. So bacterial growth requires moisture levels of about 70% in these particular products. So sauerkraut, it's produced through the process of what we call submerged fermentation, which you can read about more in the e-text. And submerged fermentation involves microorganisms being submerged in that liquid solution itself. Generally, it's composed of about 50 grams per liter of solutes and maintains a 95% water content. When we talk about the moisture content of yogurt, milk has a moisture content of about 88% and a water activity of 0.99, so very, very high water activity. Plain yogurt has a moisture content between 82 and 84%, so a little bit less water than milk itself. The water activity itself can range from 0.97 to 0.99, so still a very high water activity with this particular product. And some moisture is lost during the fermentation process, but again, not a lot of moisture. When we talk about the set type of yogurt, again, we have a situation where we have some yogurt where water is not removed after fermentation. This might be something like a plain yogurt where it's watery or a runny texture, or we might have something like a strained yogurt where after fermentation a portion of the whey is removed by straining that yogurt itself. And that might be an example of something like a Greek yogurt, which lends itself to a thicker texture that is more creamy. And this is one of the reasons why if you're looking at recipes and you're wanting to use yogurt as an ingredient in recipes, you need to make sure you understand which type of yogurt you're getting. Is it going to be a traditional plain yogurt, which again is very runny, watery, it has a different texture, or is it something like a strained yogurt that's more concentrated with a higher protein content, a thicker texture with more cream to it? I myself love to enjoy Greek yogurt as a fat-free alternative to something like sour cream. So if I have a baked potato, I'll slice it open, the steam will rise out, and I'll put some nice cold, creamy Greek yogurt on top of that baked potato, and I might choose to have it be a fat-free Greek yogurt, and I'll feel good about getting a complete protein, some inexpensive and healthy carbohydrates, as well as meeting two food groups. So you may want to learn a little bit more about the chemicals behind fermented foods. And there are different ways to ferment foods, but a lot of the different ways produce acids such as citric acid or lactic acid, which decrease the pH of the foodstuff itself, making it where it might have a longer shelf life. So fermentation can actually be used as a preservation method. With fermentation, there's some common methods, which include adding beneficial bacteria, yeasts, sometimes we add salt, sugars, because sugar can be the food for those bacteria or microorganisms, as well as sodium nitrates. So when we're talking about microbial activity, let's talk about yogurt. With yogurt production, we have milk, and we also have some active cultures, which include microbes that are going to be beneficial and grow in that culture itself. If we're going to use pasteurized yogurt, pasteurization at 203 degrees Fahrenheit kills any harmful bacteria and breaks down the whey protein that's in the milk itself. So we can do the pasteurization and then we can add in helpful bacteria to allow for that yogurt to become what it needs to be with a pH of 4 to 4.6, which prevents negative or deleterious bacterial growth from happening. And a little fun fact, in 1998 to 2008, there were actually 11 major cases of yogurt-related outbreaks that caused health issues. So we do want to make sure that the yogurt is produced properly, that we're having it stored properly, and that we're consuming it before the expiration date to minimize the likelihood of that happening. With sauerkraut and beer, we also want to discuss their microbial activity. So with sauerkraut, we have lactic acid bacteria, and these microbes produce organic acids, bacteriocins, vitamins, and flavors in that fermented cabbage. The fermentation process decreases the pH, prolonging the shelf life and increasing the nutritional content. And we've got a list of lactic acid bacteria that might be present in your sauerkraut itself. We also have beer. With beer, the microbe that's used in the fermentation process is often a yeast. And we've got a list of different yeasts that might be used in beer production. And it's commonly the first yeast that is used in ales and the second and third yeast that are listed that are used in lagers. The yeasts feed on the sugar that are released from the barley as well as other grains. So how do we safely store our yogurt? We do not want to leave our yogurt unrefrigerated for more than 2 hours. So if you get your yogurt out and you put it on the counter and you open it up and you're like, I'm gonna have that, and then you get a phone call, 3 hours, 4 hours passed, when in doubt, throw it out. We don't want you to get ill from consuming yogurt that's been out too long. Yogurt has a shelf life of 7 to 14 days if we have proper storage of that yogurt itself, or you can read the expiration date on the package as well. Storing longer than its shelf life of that 7 to 14 days, or whatever's reported on the package, can result in molds, yeast, and slow-growing bacteria. And if the yogurt's left out for a period of time that's shorter than 2 hours, it can be put back in the fridge, but it might be one of those situations where it's kind of first in, first out, where you want to consume it quickly within a day or two if you had it out on the counter for about an hour. And just as a reminder, bacteria in unrefrigerated yogurts will grow more rapidly, and they're going to grow even more rapidly when we have sugar or fruits in that yogurt itself because they have more to feed on. Next, let's talk about the storage of sauerkraut. With sauerkraut, we can have canned sauerkraut, which can be stored for about 3 years. So if you bought it and you're like, oh, we didn't use it at this cookout, our bad. Just keep it on the shelf, don't open it, and it can be stored there for a little while. Again, your cans should have an expiration date on them. Spoilage of fermented sauerkraut is rare if it's stored properly in the fridge itself. So when you're trying to discern, has it gone bad? Well, if it is darkening due to air exposure and that oxidative reaction that's occurring, you can actually just remove the brown part and continue eating the rest. Because of the low pH, because of the method of production for sauerkraut, it actually has a pretty nice long shelf life. If we have an odor change, even though you might say sauerkraut has a really strong odor, how does it change? Well, you'll notice if it changes. Or if we have, again, a change in color or texture that's pretty significant, you might decide that you might want to throw it out. With sauerkraut, the flavor does dissipate over time, and it may lose some of that crunch, or again, the flavor may change or be less robust. When you're storing beer, what we want to do is keep it in a cool and dark environment, 50 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have a basement, that might be a great place to store your beer. Or if you even have, again, a beer fridge that has the right temperature, that might be a nice place to store it. With beer itself, make sure the bottles are not at risk of falling or rolling around, because no one likes a broken beer bottle and beer spraying all over the place. We want to keep the temperature steady. If we have temperature swings, like it gets too hot or it gets too cold, then what we're going to do is have some issues. The cool temperature, if we're keeping it consistent, halts the aging process, whereas heat is going to accelerate oxidation or staleness. And if we have the bottles in sunlight, it can actually change the flavor and create kind of a skunky beer. So if you've ever opened a beer and you're like, oh, this one smells kind of skunky, it may be that it was in a beer bottle that was out at a picnic and then they didn't use it, then they put it in their garage, didn't store it properly, and then they put it in the refrigerator and gave it to you later. So improper storage can definitely change the taste profile of that beer itself. Now let's discuss the nutrient components of our 3 fermented foods, the yogurt, the beer, as well as the sauerkraut. What we're going to do in this discussion is we're going to allow you to have the portion size the exact same, or 100 grams. That way we can compare them across nutrient density, energy density, and more. Keep in mind this may not be a traditional serving size, but it does allow for a very nice comparison gram for gram. When we're looking at the nutrient components of yogurt, yogurt is made by adding live bacteria to milk, and they're going to be these beneficial bacteria. When we're looking at the essential nutrients in yogurt, we have a very high quality protein with all of the essential amino acids in the right proportions. We have some fats, and depending upon which type of yogurt you consume, you might have more or less fat. Like I mentioned in some earlier information, I enjoy a fat-free Greek yogurt, so with my nutrition facts panel of my fat-free Greek yogurt, it would say 0 grams of fat and 0 saturated fatty acids. However, if you have something that's a lower fat yogurt, probably half or more of the fatty acids or the fats in that particular yogurt will be saturated. We also have carbohydrates in the yogurt. We might have lactose, but at a much lower level than you would find in milk itself, because a lot of it has been fermented off. But we might have other added sweeteners. So after the yogurt's been made, there might be some fructose that's added in, or even some natural sugars that are added in, or honey, or fruit themselves. So those types of items that are added in after the fermentation process can drastically change the carbohydrate content of the yogurt itself. We also have vitamins and other minerals like sodium, potassium, calcium, and vitamin D, which all can vary from yogurt to yogurt. When we look at the nutrient components of sauerkraut, due to the fermentation, sauerkraut offers nutrition and health benefits far beyond those of fresh cabbage. So if we're going to make a sauerkraut, there are some sauerkraut recipes that actually call for some ingredients that have animal products in them. So we might have a little bit of like an animal broth or a brine or something like that. And in that case, not only might you have some fat associated with this sauerkraut, you might also have a little bit of cholesterol. So I thought I would share that with you. Also, with the carbohydrates, sauerkraut does have a decent amount of dietary fiber. And that dietary fiber is going to lend to a prebiotic that is going to help feed any healthy bacteria inside your intestine itself. We also have some naturally occurring sugars that are going to be in the sauerkraut. When we discuss the nutrient components of beer, beer is typically made from water, grains, hops, yeast, all added together, and then we allow for that fermentation to take place. Some individuals like to argue that beer is actually a food. I do want to say that we have some carbohydrates in beer that are going to lend us some calories, in addition to the alcohol, which can lend us some calories as well. With the carbohydrates in the beer, it can vary from beer to beer, depending upon how sweet your beer is, how fermented it is, and what other components have been added in either post-fermentation or prior to. So pay attention to the nutrient components of your beer, because it's going to be different, possibly, than your friends. When we're talking about fermented foods in the digestive system, fermented foods can play a major role in gut health. So the intestinal health and also the barrier function of the intestine are both going to be positively impacted by healthful or beneficial bacteria. Additionally, your immune system and your metabolism can be positively impacted by the presence of healthy hindgut microflora. If you have some really nice microbes in your intestine because you've consumed them in products such as something like a kombucha or other fermented foods, it can impact mood, behavior, your weight gain or loss, food cravings, hormone balance, food sensitivity, and more. So I'm not saying that fermented foods are superpower foods, that they can cure everything, but I do want to encourage you to try different fermented foods and see how all of these other factors in your life may positively be impacted. You may say, okay, all fermented foods allow for probiotic effect. That's what they do. No, fermented foods are not the same thing as a probiotic. With fermented foods that have active bacteria in them, they do have probiotics in them. However, they themselves are not considered probiotics. So how does the fermentation process impact the absorption of a variety of things at your intestinal level? Well, if we have lactic fermentation, this can actually increase the availability of iron or make iron more bioavailable in your system. Because of the fact that we have, again, a little more acid and we have this contributing chemical factors that are going to be inside that fermented product itself, iron can actually increase in absorption to the bloodstream, therefore increasing in availability to our cells themselves. With yogurt, if someone has lactose malabsorption or a lactose digestion issue, this is not necessarily going to impact calcium absorption in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, if you're consuming something like a heavily fermented yogurt, we might have very little lactose in it. And so we might have an excellent source of calcium for people who don't have as much lactase in their system or are lactose intolerant. So they might be able to consume something like yogurt and still have decent calcium absorption into their bloodstream. With beer, oftentimes people consume it in part for their effects associated with the alcohol itself. So with beer, we have a slower absorption of alcohol than some more concentrated alcoholic beverages. For example, if you're to do a shot of vodka on an empty stomach versus a beer, the beer is going to be absorbed a little bit slower because of the fact that it is not as concentrated. So your blood alcohol content might go up a little bit slower. Additionally, if you consume a meal before having that shot of vodka or that glass of beer, we will have an even slower absorption rate of the alcohol itself, lending to, again, a slower rise in blood alcohol content and less likelihood that you might overserve yourself. So with the amount of alcohol, the concentration of the alcohol in that drink itself, as well as whether your stomach is full or not, all of these are going to have an impact on blood alcohol content or blood alcohol levels that you might experience. We also have sauerkraut, and sauerkraut, if we have the active bacteria, delivers those probiotic bacteria into the gastrointestinal system, but absorption of those is not necessarily going to happen. We're not going to absorb those bacteria themselves, but it makes the intestine a lot happier. So having those bacteria present that are the healthful bacteria is going to help with potentially the absorption of other non-nutrients because your intestine health will be healthier itself. With regard to sauerkraut, it ranks high in comparison to other vegetables for absorption of iron, and this is, like I said, in part because of the lactic acid content. When we're looking at the macronutrient breakdown of things like Greek yogurt, sauerkraut, and beer, and if we want to look at a traditional serving size, like 6 ounces for Greek yogurt, 1 cup for sauerkraut, and 1 beer, then we might want to have a different lens than we did before when we were comparing them 100 grams to 100 grams to 100 grams. Ultimately, when we look at a Greek yogurt, oftentimes people choose a low-fat Greek yogurt, which will have a breakdown similar to this, with about 6.1 grams of carbohydrate, lending to about 25% of the overall calories, less than 1 gram of fat, lending to less than 10% of the overall calories from fat, and 17 grams of protein, lending to, again, close to 70% of the overall calories. Next, we have sauerkraut, and if we look at our total calories in sauerkraut, it is very low. Even consuming a whole entire cup of sauerkraut might only lend to 27 calories, with most of those calories coming from our carbohydrates themselves. So we have about 6.1 grams of carbohydrates. Again, if we're depending upon the sauerkraut production method, we might have as few as 0.2 grams of fat, maybe up to 2 grams of fat. So there might be a little bit of a range, but we have very little protein. When we look at our beer, you might say, wait a second here. If we look at our carbohydrates, fats, and protein calories, they don't add up to the total calories in that beer. It's because the rest of the calories are likely coming from alcohol. So if we were to compare Greek yogurt, sauerkraut, and beer, yes, all these fermented foods have similar production methods. However, they vary in appearance, taste, nutrient content, and even price points, as well as how we like to enjoy them. So fermentation can definitely give you some really unique products. And you may wonder, what are some health implications of consuming these fermented foods? In recent years, studies have shown that making fermented foods a part of our daily diet can be a very healthful initiative. It's strongly encouraged. So we want to select fermented foods that provide those live bacteria, or again, those probiotic bacteria within them. We want to make sure we're consuming foods with these bacteria because we can actually use those bacteria in the foods to populate our own intestine. And healthy intestinal microbiome can prevent inflammation in the body and help with overall health and well-being. It can decrease the likelihood of leaky gut syndrome, which is associated with things like asthma, eczema, schizophrenia, and Alzheimer's. So I'm not saying that having fermented foods like sauerkraut is going to totally decrease your asthma, eczema, schizophrenia, or Alzheimer's. However, the more healthful your diet, the more physical activity, and the more you're including, again, all the information from food science and human nutrition, the better off your overall health will be. So when we're investigating the health implications of things like yogurt, beer, and sauerkraut, research has shown that consuming healthful yogurt actually can decrease the risk of type 2 diabetes, decrease obesity trends, decrease cardiovascular disease incidence, and even help with overall weight control. Live cultures present in the yogurt are a healthy addition to our diet. The yogurt itself can provide calcium, which most Americans don't consume enough of. Additionally, we've got protein, magnesium, vitamin A, vitamin D, as well as phosphorus in that yogurt itself. With our beer actually does provide some antioxidants. It also provides certain B vitamins, iron, a little calcium, some phosphates, which may or may not be beneficial, as well as fiber. And over time, if you're someone who's like using this as an excuse to consume lots of beer, binge drinking 4 or more drinks at one time for women or 5 drinks for men actually increases the risk of some of these benefits that you might see through smaller consumption. So a little bit might be good for you. A lot, not so much. Overconsumption of alcohol can actually increase your risk of certain cancers as well. Sauerkraut, like we've mentioned before, contains many beneficial live cultures. Sauerkraut can act as a source of select bacteria that can act as probiotics, which help with immunity itself. Having a healthful microbiome aids in intestinal problems, so decreases the likelihood of having those problems, and it can provide many nutrients if you're consuming a plant-based fermented product such as sauerkraut. For example, some other benefits of consuming sauerkraut are that you get 4 grams of fiber in 1 cup. So you definitely get sauerkraut as a good source of fiber in your overall diet. But what are some negative health associations with the consumption of yogurt, beer, or sauerkraut? Well, yogurt can be made with high amounts of added sugars. So individuals who are consuming those fruit on the bottom yogurts, or the yogurts that have like cups that flip in and have candies in them practically, those ones might not be as beneficial for your overall health and well-being. And high sugar consumption is linked to an increased incidence of type 2 diabetes. And 8 million diabetes-related hospitalizations occur every year. So if you're someone who does have diabetes, or you might be at risk for diabetes, make sure you're reading that nutrition facts panel and choosing the yogurt that's best for you. With beer, alcohol consumption puts you at an increased risk for things like injury. And World Health Organization suggests that 10 to 18% of emergency room patients are alcohol-related cases. That's a high percentage. So definitely, if you're going to drink, drink in moderation. Sauerkraut, although it can be beneficial with many other items, it is high in sodium. And like we've mentioned before, high sodium consumption is linked to the development of hypertension in select individuals. And hypertension is a leading cause of cardiovascular diseases that we might treat in hospitals. And cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer in the United States. So if you're someone who is trying to watch your sodium intake and you're worried about high blood pressure, then sauerkraut may or may not be the best choice for you. Well, you may have been inspired by all of this information that we're sharing. So let's talk about how you can make one of these products yourself. For example, yogurt. What's needed? Well, we need some whole milk, some heavy cream, and some plain whole milk yogurt. With regard to the yogurt that we're making, this is not the fat-free, strained, concentrated Greek yogurt. This is more of a fat-full, delicious dessert yogurt itself. So what we're going to do with this yogurt is we're going to add the milk and cream to a pot. We're going to cook using medium heat to about 180 degrees Fahrenheit, and then cook for another 5 minutes while stirring to prevent burning. So we do not want this product boiling. We just want it to be heated to that 180 degrees. Then we're going to remove the pot from the heat and let it cool until it just feels warm. So you can touch it, but it's not going to be burning your hand itself. Then we can put the yogurt from this ingredient list and put it in a small bowl. Add in half a cup of the warm milk. We're going to mix with a spoon and pour the mixture back into the pot with the warm milk itself. Put the lid on and keep the yogurt and milk mixture warm. And a tip and trick, you can save some of the yogurt and use it for your next yogurt making, and you can learn from these steps and make your yogurt better and better and better each time. Next, after we've gone through the first 4 steps, we want to keep the pot warm. And one way we can do this is by wrapping it using several large towels. We can put it inside the oven with the light on, and the light itself generates a little bit of heat, or you can put it on top of the refrigerator. You might be surprised. Up there is a little bit warm. Not hot, hot, but a little bit warm, making the bacteria very happy. Next, we're going to let the yogurt sit for 6 to 12 hours until the yogurt is thick and tangy. We want a little bit of bite to it, a little acid. That's going to tell us that the fermentation has taken place. We're going to transfer the pot to the refrigerator and chill for 4 hours. Then the yogurt will thicken more once it's cold. Lastly, you can enjoy it as it is, or we can add toppings such as fruit or oats to make it even more delicious. A tip or trick, it's possible for the finished yogurt to have some water on top. Not to worry, it's still normal and it still is safe to consume. You can always pour off that liquid if it makes you more comfortable. Let's say you want to make a thicker yogurt, such as a Greek yogurt. Like I mentioned before, Greek yogurt is a normal yogurt, but it has had some water removed. So we've got less water content, which makes it thicker and creamier. So what we're going to do is prepare a big bowl and put either a sieve or a colander on top of it. Then we're going to put cheesecloth on top of that itself. And then we're going to put the yogurt in the refrigerator and let the water drain until the texture is thick enough to your liking. Therefore, you can make Greek yogurt from the previous recipe that we had. Let's review the yogurt recipe. What is the science behind it? Why are we using whole milk and then adding heavy cream? Well, using whole milk and heavy cream is to ensure that the yogurt has a thick texture. So if you want something really thick, really creamy for your dessert yogurt, that's a way to do it. The yogurt thickness is greatly affected by the fat content. If we use skim milk, totally fine, but the finished product won't be as thick as using that whole milk itself. So it depends on what type of product you might want. Why do we need to add yogurt to the milk? Why can't we just put the milk on the burner and then put the milk itself on top of the refrigerator? This recipe is an example of a back slopping fermentation. We're adding the store-bought yogurt inside the milk, and therefore we're using that lactic acid bacteria or that lab inside the yogurt to ferment the milk itself. The lab from the yogurt that we purchased is going to produce more lactic acid because it's going to be fermenting the lactose, which is that milk sugar in our milk itself. And therefore we're going to have the pH go down, we're going to have it reach that casein isoelectric point, and then the milk itself is going to make that creamy yogurt curdle. Why is it normal for yogurt to have water on top of it? Well, have you ever opened a store-bought yogurt and you've seen water on top of it? Well, not to worry, this is a normal thing to happen, and it's called syneresis, which means separation of water from a coagulated milk. It's fine just to mix the water in the yogurt to consume it, or if you're someone who's not wanting that, you can just kind of pour it down the sink itself, and then you have your yogurt just by itself without that water layer. Fermentation is definitely a field for growth. It's been dubbed Agriculture 2.0 due to the wide range of possibilities that it has. We use new ingredients, different fermented foods, we're using different bacteria strains, and so using things like rice, corn, and barley in our beer is going to be producing different products. Or fermenting to the point where we have lactose-free yogurt, or even vegan yogurts. So we have a lot of different options. Being widely recognized as a method for food production that's nutritious and long-term as it rises to the top of some of these, again, some of these like power foods, healthful foods, foods that you're supposed to be incorporating into your everyday life. And you may wonder a little bit more about plant-based fermentation. So like with beef and cheese, we have plant-based yogurts. So we can have these fermented plant-based yogurts that are going to become more and more accessible. It's done with oat milk, almond milk, and even cashew milk. And the fermentation also has the possibility to be used for flavor and sensory enhancement in some of these plant-based foods. So with that in mind, look around. See some of the plant-based foods that we have available to you. Think outside the box. Is a vegan diet something you want to explore or not? Is it something you just want to try for fun? I encourage you to explore the many things that are produced in the world of food science. And there are even more new products on the market. So kefir or kefir can be pronounced a couple different ways. This is a fermented milk drink with a sour taste. It contains an even lower lactose percent than milk or even a lot of the yogurts itself. The kefir has been seen to lower inflammation within the body, help decrease chronic health conditions, and increase bone density throughout the body itself. And it comes in a variety of flavors and products from vanilla to mango, and it even can come in something like a kefir milk or kefir yogurt or even a kefir-like based ice cream itself. I do want to bring up the fact it tastes very similar to yogurt, however, it has a much larger variety of bacteria in it than a yogurt product itself. We also have natto, which is a fermented Japanese soybean product. We use this enzyme that's been seen to prevent or lower blood clots and reduce systolic blood pressure in the food product itself. It's typically paired with rice as a traditional breakfast food to boost digestion. So, if you're thinking about new products on the market or leaning back towards products that have been out there but are now coming to your grocery store, these might be two that you might want to explore a little bit further. And if you have any questions, know that we're here for you. Stop in the virtual tutoring center or my open office hours. We can help you with any questions you might have.